Welcome to Earth, a love story. Written and read by Robin Lassiter. Chapter 2. But certainly there was an Eden on this very unhappy earth. We all long for it, and we are constantly glimpsing it. Our whole nature at its best and least corrupted, its gentlest and most humane, is still soaked with the sense of exile. J.R.R. Tolkien. Once upon a time, in the largest, least populated county in Colorado, a few miles from the New Mexico border, a back-to-the-lander settled into a tiny valley in the middle of nowhere, with a peace and love hippie, and made a life in a geodesic dome they built themselves. By the time my sister and I came along, the house was livable, insulated, with a wood-burning cook stove in the kitchen where my mom made all of our meals and heated water for us to take baths. She had to carry the water in 5-gallon buckets from the well across the arroyo, but that was all right because it was good water, and she and my dad were grateful for it. Our neighbors all had sulfur water, drinkable but smelly. We got lucky. My folks hired a well witcher named John Digger, and he found sweet water at 60 feet, and to this day, knock wood, that well is still giving water. The cook stove had a reservoir at one end which held a few gallons, and after the fire had been going for some time enough to heat up the cast iron bulk of the big stove, you could open a little door and pull down the spigot, spilling hot water into an old metal tub where my sister and I took baths. Eventually we did get running water and electricity, but for many years it was baths in the kitchen, getting scrubbed down with rough washcloths in front of the stove, an old kerosene lantern giving us a little circle of light on dark winter nights. In those years we had an outdoor composting toilet, or the garden of metabolic transmigration, as my folks called it. I remember the year we got indoor plumbing, an exciting year, because it was the same year we got a telephone. My sister and I spent our childhood playing in the runoff from afternoon monsoons and saw every blade of grass sparkling and fresh and wet once the clouds moved on. We were surrounded by big swaying ponderosas that smelled like vanilla and strawberries in the summer heat, and by ancient junipers wafting red pollen in the spring. In the late summer garden were string beans climbing orange twine, and knobby cucumbers my mom would turn into pickles, and the marigolds we planted to keep bugs away from the cabbage. That never worked, though. My sister and I were paid a nickel a beetle and made good money picking them off big dusty green leaves with our little fingers and dropping them into a plastic cup to feed to the chickens later. We had a beehive full of a wild swarm my father had caught and kept and tucked into a hillside near the house. My sister and I spent hours carefully off to the side, watching the bees come into land, so tired and heavy with pollen they could barely fly. Some years the whole valley was overwhelmed by tall yellow clover, reaching far above our heads so that when we walked through it, it was like we were making our way through a thick forest, stepping carefully in case we startled a rattlesnake. In those years, the honey was almost black, thick and syrupy and musky, and so sweet it burned our throats. One year, for reasons unknown, the yellow clover disappeared from the valley completely, and only white clover grew. That year the honey was completely clear, a watery, delicate nectar. At night there were crisp stars above the tree-black ridgeline, Orion coming to tell us there was no turning back from winter. And in our warm little dome, my mother read us to sleep by candlelight. She read us Black Beauty and Little Women and The Secret Garden and over The Hobbit. And we dreamed of horses and half-hidden gates to other worlds and dark spiders with big sticky webs. Winters were long and cold. Snow drifted high against the north-facing side of the dome. My older sister and I dug tunnels into the drifts and punched out little caverns for ourselves. We curled up with our dogs, and our breath and body heat melted the innermost layer of snow. Our mittened hands rubbed the melt back into the walls where it froze again, creating a hard inner shell, We grinned at each other, clever and warm inside of our little snow caves. My mother called us in for winter ice cream, a big stainless steel bowl scooped full of snow mixed with condensed milk and sugar and vanilla. At the first sign of spring, my mother took us into the forest where we found fuzzy purple pasque flowers pushing up through the remnants of snow clinging to the carpet of fallen pine needles. She sang sweet songs and showed us how to make mud pies and took us down to the stream that crossed the mouth of the valley to search for snails and water striders there. We always looked for fish, too, but only found quarter-sized toads and sometimes long, black, shiny, squirming leeches. The red-winged blackbirds landed heavily on cattails, rocking back and forth like metronomes, calling their watery calls. These are the snapshot memories of my childhood, and they wove my reality together like a poem. The golden-bellied bees heavy with pollen, the black and white magpies calling from high up in the big ponderosa across the pond, my mother dancing in the kitchen, tiny sun-bleached mouse bones on big red anthills, my father building a bridge, the flashing red wings, the garden marigolds with their strong medicinal smell, the sound of coyotes calling and of our dogs barking them away, the little rivers that appeared after the rains, the steep arroyos craggy from erosion, and the big white rooster that would peck a hole in the back of my hand if I wasn't careful when I went to collect the eggs. There was all of this, and then, best of all, there were the horses. A kaleidoscope of horses swirling around me in my dreams and in my waking life and in my drawings and my stories. They were a reason to tromp through the forests, up and down the 2 ridges that sheltered our valley, a reason to run until it felt like my lungs would burst, a reason to become strong and tenacious. When I was a year old, my parents went to a livestock auction and came home with a 2-month-old, terrified, bucking, grew-ya-done filly. Her mother had been sold for dog food, but my parents paid $45 and saved Glory. The story goes that my mother was crying and bidding on all of the broken horses, driving up the prices, so the dealers got together and let her have this little one to shut her up and send her on her way. Before Glory, there was Mary run with the deer. My parents bought her and put her in the valley, and with no other horses to keep her company, she kept the company of the deer, who stole delicately into the meadows in the early, wet, dewy mornings. I never knew Mary, though, because there was a rough, scary man who lived a few ridges over, and he came and stole her and sold her, and my folks never got her back. That story always made me sad, because the man beat his dogs and his kids and his wife, and I hated to think of Mary having to be with him until he sold her, and wondered who he sold her to and was that person good to her. That man was killed a few years later, shot dead while he was beating his wife half to death with a pipe. He was like a rabid dog, my dad told me, who had to be put down for the good of the community. I always listened to what my father said, nodding, with wide eyes and a serious little pinched mouth. After Glory came a pregnant paint pony, a black and white Shetland mare with a sickle moon on her forehead named Gypsy. Gypsy was my sister's horse and Gypsy's foal was mine, a chestnut and white filly we named Sunspot. I loved Sunny and took sun-dappled naps with her, my face pressed into her side. She smelled like hay and sage and that dusty, perfect horse smell, and I heard her heartbeat thud and her breath fill her lungs and felt her twitch away a fly. I dreamed of horses every night and rode them bareback every day for miles and miles through the ridges and valleys. My sister and I slept in our riding clothes and woke before sunrise to catch the horses when they came in for water. If we woke up too late to catch them then, we'd put on our bought-at-the-local thrift store cowboy boots, sling bridles over our shoulders, shove handfuls of oats into our pockets, and walk the trails to find them and try to tempt them close enough to catch. In the heat of the day, they'd likely be deep in the forest on the north-facing side of the North Ridge, up above Mosquito Swamp. In the afternoons after the monsoon rain swept through, we might find them grazing in Meadow of Morning or at the end of the canyon. The tough part was if they sensed us coming, they'd be off, and we'd have to chase them up and over the ridges and into the valleys, so that by the time we got to start riding, we'd all have already run 3 or 4 miles. In the winter, they were easier to find, hanging around the barn waiting to get fed big piles of fragrant hay that we'd stacked in the fall. Getting hay with my dad and my sister is still one of my very favorite memories. And every fall when I smell green chilies roasting and see that clear blue fall sky and the cottonwood leaves starting to yellow, I think of us in an old pickup truck bouncing slowly through the hay fields out east of town. My sister and I took turns driving the truck, reaching the pedals with our tiptoes, our necks stretched long so we could see over the steering wheel, creeping along in low gear, going from bale to bale while my dad walked alongside and tossed them up onto the truck. Later, I got strong enough to buck the 70-pound bales too, grabbing a line of twine, one in each hand, and then hoisting them up to my waist, and if I timed it right, lifting a knee into the bale and using the momentum to toss them up onto the truck. We'd go home the long way to avoid being on the main road with our big load of hay. That meant driving through Ludlow Canyon and hearing the stories about the miners there who in 1914 went on strike, and how the Colorado National Guard came to break them up with machine guns and fire. They shot miners and burned their tents, suffocating in smoke 11 children and 2 women who dug a pit under their tent to avoid the gunfight. The Ludlow Memorial stands today with a dark stairway into a concrete pit filled with ghosts and grief to mark the spot where the women and children died. One time driving home from getting hay, I looked down into the arroyo that holds the sweet stream of Ludlow Canyon, and in a big, solid block of rock, beneath an overhanging juniper tree, I saw a dark doorway with a little girl in a light blue skirt standing in it. I looked and looked for that doorway every time we drove through the canyon, but never saw it or the girl again. We would listen to the stories and look at the ruins of the old coal town and feel the ghosts of the dead and wind our way through the narrow valley, making sure no bales were lost on a sharp turn. After we made it home and unloaded and stacked the bales high into the little barn, we'd go inside pink-cheeked and tired, our jeans fuzzy with tiny bits of hay scratching our thighs, fingers sore from the twine pressing into them. The hot meal and warm fire that Mom had waiting dissolved the shadows of grief gathered from driving through Ludlow, and as ever, we were restored to warmth and comfort. In the winter, after the horses ate breakfast, we'd catch them and saddle them, the only time we used saddles, and only then so we could wrap the end of a long rope around the saddle horn and pull each other through the snow on a round red plastic sled. Our poor long-suffering ponies. They worked hard for us, but they evened the score too. There's nothing like the terror of turning towards home and feeling the horse beneath you gather her strength, arch her neck, shift the bit forward between her teeth, and know that soon she will bolt and head for the low branches to try to peel you off. There was nothing to do but hitch up our knees higher and grab a handful of mane and lean low and hang on for dear life. We got broken wrists when they dumped us. I had a concussion and a punctured kidney, and once I was kicked in the ribs so hard that I lost all my breath and had to crawl on my hands and knees the whole way back to the house. I had a purple and yellow and green bruise from my hip to my armpit for weeks. Even still, the horses were the best thing that my parents could have possibly done for me. I loved my childhood from the back of a horse. My sister and I named every rock and game trail, every big old gnarled tree that had a personality, and every meadow according to its character. We picked tall, dried mullein spears and pretended to be knights, charging towards each other and veering off at the last minute. We packed picnics and rode to the top of the ridge to sit in the shade of the ponderosas and look out over the blue-green rolling hills that faded into the distance, eventually turning into stepped mesas or snow-capped mountains, depending whether you looked south or west. We fed our horses bits of bread from our sandwiches and let them lick the icing off our cupcakes and gave them salty potato chips that they ate with their ears pricked forward, nodding their heads or turning up their lips at the taste. When we were old enough, we started to ride Glory. She was our big horse, little by any standard, only 14 hands, mouse gray with black legs, a black mane and tail, a thick black stripe down the center of her back, and dark bars streaked across her legs, giving away her ancient origins. She wasn't brutal to us like our ponies were. She never bucked. She never ran away with us. She never hurt us, and we witnessed life together in our little valley. When my sister got a little older and stopped riding with me every day, I spent most of my time with Glory. Glory and I outraced summer storms, hailstones smacking broad oak leaves right behind us, pressing us faster. We jumped fallen logs and relaxed under the shade of the big perfumed ponderosas. We knew every inch of the valley and how the first day of spring and the last day of summer smelled. We heard a rustling in the grass and peeked in to find a tiny garden snake wrapped around a tiny brown mouse. The garden snake rhythmically constricting and the little mouse's eyes darting. We knew what time of day the mosquitoes would be bad near the stream and when was best to see an owl on Serendipity Trail. Once we galloped up a hill through the forest and burst into a small meadow, surprising a big herd of elk. They bolted, and for a few strides we were with them, a sea of bobbing brown backs around us, and the bulls' huge antlers rising above us all. Soon enough they outran us, and we watched them stream down the hill, over the fence and into the next valley. Coming home from a long ride one day, Glory spooked sideways and snorted and arched her neck and strained her ears forward and flared her nostrils to show me 2 rattlesnakes just ahead, moving fast. Their heads were off the ground, gazes locked onto each other, their bodies making matching S's as they traveled. Suddenly they lunged towards each other and writhed together, kicking up dust. Glory decided that was enough, and we ran away together, fast, flashing through the shallow pond, up the hill and through the forest, all the way back to the barn. And then there was one day, I was maybe 9 or 10, lying in the shade with my hands beneath my head. Glory was grazing next to me, rhythmically ripping and chewing mouthfuls of sweet summer grass. I had a long piece of oat grass between my teeth and was gently biting the tender, sweet end and rolling it against my tongue. Through the ponderosa pine needles high above me, big round white clouds hung suspended against the blue sky. I caught the barest whiff of moisture from them, mixed with the smell of Glory's sweat drying and her sweet breath. My vision blurred. I felt my whole self there in that moment, and how I was entwined with Glory and the grass and the dirt, the buzzing bugs and the sweet tip rolling against my tongue, and the smells and trees and that big blue sky with its big 3-dimensional clouds hanging in its big 3-dimensional space. I knew that the grass Glory was eating and her body and mine would eventually molder into the dirt, and then grass would eat us, and that was just fine and as it should be. Everything was connected. It was a moment of peace and clarity. It was a wholeness that went deep into my bones and stayed with me. I still hold the blueprint. My beautiful childhood, my beautiful family. My mother called me Princess Tangle and chased me around with a brush, trying to tame my massive orange hair. I came by it honest, between her long golden tresses that she laid down and straightened between a water-heated iron and the top of our wood cook stove, I swear, and my dad's red, curly ball of hair with the long braid down his back. My sister and I were pale, freckled, and copper, wild, muddy, feral children. We were born just 15 months apart, and people thought we were twins when we got cleaned up and went to town wearing our matching handmade dresses. And can you imagine how much I hated my going to town shoes? I spent early spring waiting for the ground to thaw enough to squelch my bare toes into the first mud puddle that appeared, melted out of the mass of snow on the north-facing side of the valley. Every now and then the Jehovah's Witnesses would come visit, hiking up our long dirt road to preach to my mother, horrified to find us naked in the pond, my mother barefoot, and telling them that God was in the garden and would they like to meet her. Mom grew up in Dallas, and her father had bought an old rundown cabin in Eagle Nest, New Mexico in the 40s. She and her folks and her 3 sisters and 1 brother spent summer vacations there, escaping the Texas heat. She only ever wanted to live in a little cabin in the woods, and when she grew up, she got married and moved to Trinidad, Colorado, hoping for that life. Instead, she lived in a tiny government house in town, waiting for her husband to decide if he wanted to have kids with her, or if he ever wanted to get land and have a garden, or if now that he'd finished his nursing degree, could she go to school, which had been the promises made when they got married. When he said no, he didn't want that life after all, she decided to make the best of things and asked him to at least buy her a washing machine, so she didn't have to go down to the laundromat and walk past the creeps in their Jeeps, watching the women work. He said no to that too, good thing for my sister and me, and while she was at the laundromat, she saw my dad with his rainbow suspenders and the dragon embroidered onto his pack, and she struck up a conversation. My father had hitchhiked to town to wash his clothes and be around people and watch women work, and he told her about the dome and the land. And I'm sure there was more to it, but according to the story that was passed down to me and my sister, that was pretty much it. My father told me he was walking home in the dark one night from the neighbor's house, a mile away as the crow flies, and when he stepped into the pitch-dark dome, he could feel someone's presence in the space. He called out, "Who's in here?" And it was my mom, upstairs, in the loft, in his bed. My dad grew up in Newport News, Virginia, in a cinder block row house where the cockroaches scuttled away when the kitchen light was flicked on at night. His father, my grandfather, fell dead at 48 years old in a gas station parking lot in Cookeville, Tennessee. My father was 18, and his father's death made him head of the household and spared him from being drafted into the Vietnam War. My father went to Virginia Commonwealth University and got a degree in commercial art. He bought an old Chevy truck and erected a canvas-covered hoop, like a covered wagon, across the bed of it and drove west, as far away from the row houses and the poverty as he could get, to look for his place in the world. What he found was a little valley in southern Colorado, 25 miles from the nearest town. Neither of my folks had any money, so they worked on the dome as they could afford it. In the meantime, they kept their clothes under the covers at night so they would already be warm when they got dressed in the morning. My mom told me they bought bananas once, and by morning you could have killed someone with them, frozen solid. They got pregnant with my sister right away, and my dad got a job, hitchhiking into town each morning and getting dropped off 3 miles from home each night. He'd walk up the road and feel his heart well up when he came over the hill to see the dome lit up and warm, knowing my mom was cooking something nice and nourishing after his long day laying block or riding a shovel or hanging drywall. There are endless, sweet stories of their early days with Mary Run with the Deer and their turkeys that roosted in the trees at night, and how their first Christmas together, my dad bought my mom some ribbons for her hair, and she went to the thrift store and found him a platter with bluebirds on it. On Saturday nights, they'd have mock fried chicken, which was a can of cream corn poured over fried potatoes. When my sister came, they had $14 in the bank. For Easter Sundays, me and my sister dressed up in pleated skirts and shiny white shoes, mine always scuffed, and our folks hid the eggs we dyed the night before in among the scrub oak and sage. Easter Sunday nights, my dad made sure to tell us about the origin of the word Easter. Esther, a pre-Christian goddess who was celebrated at the beginning of spring, and it all had to do with fertility and life returning after a long winter. That made much more sense in our little valley than some confusing story we'd heard about Jesus and a giant rabbit hiding eggs together. We also learned about the golden mean and Pythagoras and the magic of the number 9, what art is and isn't, how to shoot a gun, and how to chop kindling without chopping off a finger. A horseshoe hung over our little front door, for luck, and on the other side was a growing collection of wishbones from Thanksgivings and Christmases. Not broken, because we already had everything we needed, and best to save the wishes for a rainy day, if it ever came. All of this made up the rich drama of my childhood, and it was idyllic. I think I agreed to come to this planet with the strict stipulation that I get to experience a lot of beauty, a lot of magic, and a lot of reasons to deeply love it here. I needed my fairy tale childhood to remind me of heaven so that I would know it is possible for it to exist here on earth, and to galvanize me for what was to come. Because woven directly into the beauty is the suffering. This life on earth thing is not for the faint of heart. For more information, visit honeyheart.org.